Hi folks, Chase here again. We're going to jump into Hubbard Chapter 3, which is on supply and demand, and this will probably be in multiple parts, so let's call this Part 1, and we're going to tackle the demand side. I want you to recognize that supply and demand is really the model that is supposed to be explaining where we're getting prices from. And prices, of course, are critical because, as Smith described, this is how people know what to do. This is where information comes from inside of an economy that's organized with a market. So let's jump right in. When we're talking about demand, you will see it sometimes in the form of a demand schedule. You will see it graphically with a curve. And I want you to distinguish between demand and quantity demanded. Quantity demanded, we're going to find out, is a specific amount that people would be interested in at a specific price. So let's start with schedules first, or a demand table you'll sometimes hear it called. You can have the price of a good, and we can also talk about the quantity that folks would demand at any given price. So we can start out with watches, and we could say that a watch is going to cost $300. And if $300 is what a watch costs, then you may have 2 million people that want that watch. However, if watches go up to $400 a watch, you might find that there are now only 1.5 million people who are interested in that watch. This is essentially a demand schedule, and it is showing the relationship between P and Q, quantity demanded in this case. Now, of course, each of these represent a data point that you could turn around and graph. We're going to put quantity on the horizontal axis. We're going to put price on the vertical axis. And at price 300, we know that folks were interested in 2 million watches. Okay? We raise the price to 400. People all of a sudden only wanted 1.5 million. What you're going to see here is that you could start connecting together all of the possible prices and quantities that exist, and you will get yourself eventually to a demand curve. This demand curve is going to be downward sloping, and we'll talk about why that is on the next slide. Okay, lots of you are probably thinking that the demand curve is obviously downward sloping and there's nothing really that needs to be explained there other than common sense. If you're feeling that way about it, I think that's just fine. But for the sake of learning some of the formal lingo, I want you to recognize that the law of demand states that as price rises, quantity demanded is going to fall. And you can think about that for a couple of different reasons. One, they call the income effect, because as prices go up, if your income hasn't changed, your income buys less for you, so you'd want less of the product. The other thing that we can talk about is the substitution effect, which basically shows that as the price rises, other goods whose price haven't risen now look relatively cheaper. Therefore, you'd probably want less of the good whose price has risen. This is called the substitution effect. Some people make a big deal out of those. I actually think that they're useful at times, but really not that big of a deal. So, the law of demand implies an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. And I'm going to draw this demand curve here as a downward sloping curve. It's the way you'd normally expect a demand curve to look. Okay, so let's distinguish between movements along and shifts. Movements along are going to be caused by a change in the price of the good in question. And if you're looking at this graphically, what we're talking about is a change in the price of the good in question, and that implies that there should be a change in the quantity demanded that we would want. Okay, so the movement from this point, we'll call it A, to this point here, B, This is a movement along caused by change in the price of the good in question. Now, what we're seeing with a movement along is the relationship between price and quantity. However, there's a whole bunch of other things that are relevant for discussions about demand. We're going to talk about these as shifts, but I want to show you what one of them would look like graphically first. A shift is going to be a move of the entire curve. So we're going to go from D0 to D1. And you might be going, all right, what does that mean? What it means is that at any given price, you actually now are going to request a higher quantity than you used to. We're going to refer to this as an increase in demand. And I want you to realize right away that anytime we move a curve to the right, this is going to be an increase. If we move that same curve to the left, then we are dealing with the exact opposite, and leftward shifts are going to be decreases. Okay? Left decrease, right increase. Nail that down right away, and it's going to be a little weird because most of the time you're used to looking at a graph and you are accustomed to seeing, you're accustomed to reading it up and down along this vertical axis. In this case, with supply and demand, we're constantly going to be reading from left to right. Demand curve goes to the right and Q increases. Okay? Okay, so what are those things that are actually going to cause the demand curve to shift around? The fancy way of describing them is a non-price determinant. More often than not, they're just referred to as shift factors. And we've got 5 of them here that I'd like you to know by heart. We can expand on this later in the course if you like. Tastes and preferences are the most obvious one. And of course, if people are going to see an increase in tastes for a particular object, then we would expect to see that there's going to be an increase in demand for that object. Income, we're going to actually have to distinguish between normal and inferior goods. Income we're going to represent as a Y, right? Y variable. And normal goods, if we see an increase in income, we expect to see that there's an increase in demand. And it's just defined as such. Inferior goods, if we see that same increase in income, we are going to expect that there is a fall in demand. Instant noodles are a good example of inferior goods. Frozen burritos, fast food, anything that looks less attractive as people make more money. Whereas square footage in housing, apartments, cars, clothing, all of these things have a tendency to be normal goods. People make more money, they want more of them. A third one is the price of related goods, and we're going to talk about 2 different kinds of ways goods can be related. They can be related as substitutes, and I want you to think of substitutes as an or. What I mean by that is you're going to go to the store and you are thinking about buying lemons or limes. Okay. If lemons have gone up in price, you're going to demand more limes, right? But it's an or. Complements, we're thinking about something like cereal and milk. If cereal gets more expensive, you're not going to want to buy the cereal if the law of demand holds. And if you're not going to want to buy the cereal, then you may not have any need for the milk. Okay? Complements work like such. Hence, the price of a complement rising means that the demand for the good in question will fall, whereas the price of a substitute rising means that the demand for the good in question will rise. Population is pretty straightforward. If population or a specific relevant demographic increases, then we're going to expect to see an increase in demand. Expectations are sort of an interesting one. Consumers have expectations about future prices, and those expectations about future prices change how they behave in the present. So, as an example, Every time a Democratic president has been elected to office, there has been a general panic that access to firearms or bullets would be restricted. And people with that expectation freak out and they run and they buy tons and tons of bullets and guns. You can see evidence of this with news clips where people are literally coming out of sporting goods stores and they've bought a pallet full of bullets. Now, the interesting thing about this was after the last president was elected, Democratic president, there were no real significant changes in gun control. So the people were wrong about their fears. But that's not the important point. The important point is that they were acting differently based on their expectations. So if you believe that prices will rise in the future, then of course that means that you're going to demand less in the present. So keep that in mind. Okay, so let's run through a couple of real quick examples. First thing that I want you to remember, rightward shift means increase in demand. Leftward shift means decrease in demand. Okay? So, if Adele tells everyone that the reason she is wonderful and has such a nice voice is because she eats mangoes every day, then you might imagine that the demand for mangoes would jump suddenly, which means that at any given price, people all of a sudden now want a whole lot more quantity. Okay? That's an increase in demand. That would be based on tastes and preferences. If we go to the store and we find out that the price of eggs has risen and we want to know what's going to happen to bacon, demand for bacon. If eggs are more expensive, we're less likely to buy eggs. And if we are less likely to buy eggs, then we are, of course, less likely to buy bacon. Demand for bacon is going to fall. Okay, so there's one that's a complement. You can also look at population. If you have a baby boom and there's a ton more infants that have been born, then that population going up is, of course, going to lead to higher demand for diapers, let's say. Okay. This will give you a rightward shift in the demand curve. Okay. So very important. Right means an increase, left means a decrease. Later on, we're going to have to put supply and demand together to be able to talk about what's happening with price, because it's going to depend on both of those curves. But it's essential you know what to do with either one of these curves, demand or supply. I think that'll do it for right now. Let's leave this at just the demand stuff. Next lecture, we'll pick up with the supply.